The following contains situations and circumstances that are relatable to all women, but are still uncomfortable and sometimes quite awful. We don't pull any punches. Listener discretion is advised.
Life's a foolish game. Do you ever feel the same? Well, maybe we could change. Turn the ship another way. Feel it in the darkness. We're sailing right into those jagged cliffs. Yeah. Some say we've always been insane. Hey, life's a foolish game. Life's a foolish game.
It takes strong-willed women to change the world, but what happens when our priorities don't align? Do we let ourselves fall into the catfight trap, or brush it off and keep going? Welcome to Frenemies, a Toil and Trouble Media original. On this show, we discuss notable women and the rivalries that help define them. This week, two icons of the women's equality movement lock horns over freedom, justice, and what it means to be a woman. It's the story of Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. Betty Friedan was born Betty Naomi Goldstein on February 4th, 1921, in Peoria, Illinois. Her father, a jeweler and Russian immigrant, her mother, a former journalist turned housewife. She was raised on a steady diet of books and ideas from the time she could walk. While her grandmother had dissuaded her mother from doing so, Betty's mother encouraged her to pursue academics. She may have ultimately turned away from her own career, but that didn't mean she wanted her daughter to think it was her only option. With her parents' encouragement, Betty founded her high school's first literary magazine and graduated in 1938. After graduation, she attended Smith College, an all-women's liberal arts college in Northampton, Massachusetts, where she pursued a degree in psychology and wrote and edited the college newspaper. In 1942, she graduated with honors and accepted a doctoral internship at the University of California, Berkeley, under Erik Erikson. The Erik Erikson, the guy who established the psychosocial development theory, which states people undergo 8 stages of development from birth to death. So it was a pretty big deal. She also started dating, eventually having a steady boyfriend. A physicist who wasn't crazy about her having an opportunity far more stellar than his own. After a while, he demanded she drop her studies with that old "it's him or me" line. And sadly, she chose the douchebag. But she soon came to her senses, and in 1943, Betty returned to journalism, primarily covering women's issues and labor unions. And she found herself. Betty embraced her intellectual acumen and her ability to quickly discern information and solve problems while the rest of the world was still spinning its wheels. The written page became her stage, and social issues the platform of which she would dedicate the rest of her life. Once she found this passion, Betty knew her mission. She was going to change the world. Dissenters be damned. Within a few years, she married Carl Friedan, a manager at a public relations firm, and the two started a family. Carl loved his wife's drive, her spark, and her desire to improve her community. But the fact that she balanced this with her obligations to the home and their children were equally appreciated. And at least from the outside, the two in their traditional roles made a pretty good pair. By 1952, she was covering hard-hitting, overlooked topics like the discrimination faced by women of color, but was fired that same year after giving birth to her second child. Because the newspaper thought being a two-time mother made her an unfit employee. Nice. Determined to shove her bylines straight up their asses, she supported her family by freelancing for magazines. And when they didn't come to her with ideas, she pitched them her own. In 1957, she returned to Smith College for her 15-year class reunion. Her purpose was twofold. In addition to catching up with old friends, she conducted a survey of her classmates' quality of lives. To her dismay, of the 200 responses she received, the vast majority reported suffering from the problem that had no name. They were supposed to be happy in their American dreams, with a white picket fence, 2.5 children, and a working husband. But many reported they were bored, anxious, and depressed. When she delved further, she noticed a significant predictor of this discontent stemmed from having to give up either their careers or higher education for motherhood. The results inspired her to write about the challenges women face in these settings, including personal anecdotes to hit her points home. She pitched her work and waited for a magazine to pick it up. All of them rejected it. And I feel you, sister. Undeterred, she watered down her research and compiled it into an article published in the September 1960 issue of Good Housekeeping, titled, "Women Are People Too." The feedback she received from readers across the country made her see that the problem was much more widespread than she realized. She spent years researching women's issues and gathering more stories, which she compiled into her first published book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. In it, she attacked the myth of the happy housewife and its effects upon society as a whole. Blaming the cultural catastrophe on the mass anxiety from World War II and the Cold War, she posed that Americans compensated for their intense, unidentified trauma by controlling their immediate environment. The only place they could, in their homes. In this scenario, Betty argued women were disadvantaged by a system that limited female choice and opportunity. A new status quo which arbitrarily designated the man as the breadwinner, the woman the homemaker. As this societal structure was subconsciously conceived and reinforced, the notion of this being a conscious choice wasn't true, and the idea of the voluntary homemaker a myth. She didn't pull punches when she called out who was to blame either. Advertising executives, social scientists, educators, and even women's magazines not only perpetrated this stereotype, but frequently profited from it. Kind of like mousy, entitled South Africans who use generational wealth earned by exploiting Black people to influence an election and buy a seat as the president's first buddy. And yeah, it's been a while, but it still sounds just as creepy. She also landed a few punches that would have made Erikson proud, chastising Freud's theories that portrayed women as childlike and incapable of handling careers. What did a guy with such a flaming penis fetish know about women? Could anyone explain that? Anyone? But the model didn't need to be rejected, only tweaked. Educational disparities and gender-specific curricula could be overhauled. Systems could be remodeled to reflect equal choice and opportunity for both sexes. It was that simple. The blistering critique of domestic bliss sold more than 2 million copies in its first year and made Betty a celebrity. Finally, people were listening to her, and Betty was going to make the most of it. Writing the book gave Betty the opportunity to examine her own upbringing as well as the formation of her perspectives and ideals. She realized that she'd never really had a positive female role model who juggled both family and profession when she was growing up. She wondered how many other women could say the same. And what were the long-term effects of this opportunity vacuum, personally as well as societally? She noted there were times when she was almost terrified of being alone. Was this related? Continuing down that rabbit hole, Betty recognized other fears too. What of other women who felt like she did? Were they already defeated? Without her, would they succumb to the female mystique? So she took advantage of her newfound attention to expand her reach and solidify her position as an expert. But more than that, an authority for feminism. Despite its popularity, the book was a frequent thorn in the side of the Friedans. Threatened by her widely known work, traditional housewives didn't want a thing to do with her. Their kids were kicked off carpools, and friends were quick to distance themselves. Oops. Publicly, he supported her work, describing her as driven and a dynamo, but privately, Carl advised her to calm it down, generating a response most women could feel almost immediately, somewhere between a vicious wolverine and an angry hive of bees. But behind closed doors, he saw her metamorphosis a little differently, calling her egocentric, lunatic, and my personal favorite, super aggressive. For the guys out there listening, and good for you, aggressive is the female equivalent to a nut punch. It's the blanket term men use to shut down a woman asserting herself in the most unattractive way possible. Now leave it to a man to call a trait like that ugly. My advice? Adopt the same stance you do when your buddy begins spouting off about how great that sports team is you don't like. If you can shut your yap for that guy, you can tolerate a woman speaking out as well. And you may actually be better for it. She didn't invent this dynamic. She simply acknowledged it. And she sure wasn't about to stuff that genie back into the bottle now. Once enlightened as to the greater impact of the current system, Betty was unstoppable. Her interviews and lectures took her away from the home for days at a time. Soon, weeks. Even when she was home, Carl began to bemoan that she wasn't really there anyway, and certainly not the housewife he had expected. But there is always a price to be paid when you're changing the world. Just ask Gloria Steinem. Gloria was born on March 25, 1934, in Toledo, Ohio, the descendant of a long line of difficult women. Her grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem, was the Educational Committee chairwoman of the National Women's Suffrage Association, a delegate to the 1908 International Council of Women, the first woman to be elected to the Toledo Board of Education, and a Holocaust hero. In other words, super aggressive. Along with her parents, Leo and Ruth, Gloria spent her early childhood on the road while her father worked as an antiques picker. Things with her mother were a little more complicated. Contemporary accounts describe the woman as mentally fragile, with frequent crises that most authorities describe today as anxiety and agoraphobia. Before Gloria was born, Ruth had a nervous breakdown, which frequently left her incapable of caring for herself, struggling to distinguish fantasy from reality, and sometimes becoming violent. Her loved ones said she changed from an energetic, fun, book-loving person into someone terrified to be alone, unable to function. Spending long periods of time in and out of treatment took a toll on their marriage, and her parents separated in 1944 when Gloria was 10 years old. Her father left to find work in California, and she stayed behind in Toledo to care for her mom. Now, mental health is not a static thing. Like every other element of your overall well-being, it's fluid. Conditions like this can happen to anyone, and when they do, it's important to seek treatment from a qualified professional. That being said, this kind of severity is very rare, and most people suffering from one or a combination of these often rely on a little extra support, but can still be very loving, capable partners and parents. And it seems Gloria was aware of this. She's never attributed misogyny or blamed her father for their breakup. She understood. Although the fact that she had to come to terms with this as a fifth grader is really kind of sad. But the separation did have an impact on her perspective. Without his financial support, Leo's absence only increased the household stress. Unwilling to blame her mother for something so clearly out of her control, Gloria observed the callous and apathetic way society treated them and concluded it was anti-woman. Inspired to change the social and political inequalities she saw all around her, Gloria attended Smith College, where she studied government. When she graduated magna cum laude in 1956, she was awarded the Chester Bowles Fellowship, an opportunity to spend 2 years studying in India, which almost didn't come to pass. The following year, she was impregnated. As a fan of bad sci-fi and monster movies, I imagine my B-movie peers are half expecting me to finish that sentence with, "The creature from Planet X," or something like that. But it's important to put these things in perspective, particularly in this case, what Gloria was in control of and what she wasn't. Gloria had sex. It was with her then-fiancé with her consent. That she was in control of. But Gloria was also ovulating. That was something she had no control of. So she didn't get pregnant like one gets a decaf double foam latte. It occurred. And since the Supreme Court decided it works like that for a man, it'll work like that for our girl. In 1957, Gloria had an abortion. The illegal procedure was performed outside the U.S. by a British physician. Years later, Gloria acknowledged the doctor took considerable risk by doing so and made her promise never to tell anyone his name and to go out and do what she liked with her life. She only kept half that promise. She personally identified the doctor years later, citing his full name in a dedication for one of her books. But how many of us follow doctors' instructions to the letter? I mean, really? But she did go on to study in India, and the experience inspired a calling to grassroots activism. When she returned, she served as the director of the Independence Research Service, an organization secretly funded by the CIA. And in 1960, she launched a career as a journalist, which was definitely a step up. The CIA is not exactly known for their social justice efforts, are they? Like Betty, Gloria's early articles were mostly fluff pieces, harmless filler no more challenging than reviews of pantyhose. She yearned to cover hard-hitting, relevant topics like the Civil Rights Act and Equal Pay Act. But when she suggested this, editors shot her down, saying they didn't think of her that way. Which is editor code for stick to your pantyhose, sweetie. But Esquire magazine's features editor gave her a chance, and soon Gloria knocked it out of the park with a compelling article about contraception, which the editor immediately shot down. Picking herself back up, she revamped the article and changed its focus to be about how women are forced to choose between a career and marriage. It was published in 1962, beating the feminine mystique to press by a year. Not that she was counting. If anything, Gloria saw it as a nod that she was going in the right direction. Gloria scored national attention in 1963 when Show magazine hired her to go undercover to report on Hugh Hefner's Playboy Club. Her exposé, "I Was a Playboy Bunny," revealed just how cringy the working conditions as a bunny waitress were. But while the piece grabbed attention, it backfired on its author. The article and subsequent coverage included pictures of Gloria in full bunny regalia, a busty, French-cut bodysuit with ears and a tail. It didn't matter why she was being a bunny. Being a bunny was all the media saw. And once an editor connected her to the piece, they just wanted her to do more bunny-related material. And it became hard for her to find serious work. But Hugh Hefner was listening. And if he didn't improve the girls' working conditions, at least he didn't make them any more terrible. So there's that. In 1964, Betty decided the women's movement needed more than just a book and some jazzy articles. It needed to organize. So she and some friends founded the National Organization for Women, or NOW, with Betty serving as the first president. Now's mission was to challenge the traditional assumption that a woman has to choose between marriage and motherhood on one hand, and serious participation in industry or the professions on the other. Within 2 years, the group's membership stood at about 300, mostly professional women. But not men. The founders didn't believe that men should hold membership in a group designed to uplift women. The concept of allies still decades away. This was a problem for Betty, who saw the alienation of husbands as detrimental to the cause. How were they supposed to enjoy domestic tranquility if their husbands couldn't be included? Without equal input and participation, could they get any masculine backing at all? But she couldn't throw stones. She openly berated lesbians, calling them men-hating women, and ignored bisexual, transsexual, and pansexual women altogether. Which is pretty Freudian of her, don't you think? She also bashed them in the feminine mystique, something she was criticized for by the LGBTQAI+ community, and rightfully so. She openly excluded them every chance she got, and the hypocrisy was obvious, as was the near-laser focus she paid to her middle-class peers, while completely ignoring the challenges of women of color and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Women who were impacted far more by the systemic inequities she discussed. It was kind of a crappy thing to do, but the concept of Karens was still a few decades away as well. Advocating for an end to job discrimination through lobbying, education, and legislation, the group championed paid maternity leave, the establishment of childcare facilities, and the legalization of abortion. It also supported a constitutional equal rights amendment, guaranteeing women the same rights as men. Which was a huge deal. In the 1960s, it was still completely legal to discriminate against women in a number of areas. Companies could specifically prevent women from being hired or promoted, and often paid them less on the grounds that if they didn't have a husband to support them, they should. The same went for colleges and universities, which would be happy to enroll women in secretarial programs, but not medical or legal degrees. The law didn't function much better as it still offered very few protections for those battered and abused. And even those who were happily married had unequal dependency on their spouses as well. In many places, it was still illegal for women to have credit cards, apply for loans, hold bank accounts, or own property without it being co-owned by their husband, even if the income or property was exclusively hers. This really was no surprise. Women were starkly underrepresented in political offices as well, as they were in the fields of medicine, science, agriculture, academics, and law enforcement. Betty and the ladies of Now crafted a Women's Bill of Rights, which declared that women should have the same fundamental rights as men, including equal educational and employment opportunities and maternity leave. Which, as the baby-making members of society, is absolutely necessary, fellas. Your mom needed it too. And before somebody pops off something stupid like it's not important since it only applies to women, I'm all for paternity leave too. We should prioritize a parent's right to care for their children. Too many people are harmed without it. By the late 1960s, the public was following our girls and the media wasn't far behind. To keep readers interested and their outlet relevant, stories often pitted the mother of feminism against her younger, more modern cohort, which wasn't really fair to the women or the movement. As a result, many generalized their rivalry as a personality conflict, or excused it by claiming they never had an opportunity to get along in the first place. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Like any disagreement where both parties are equally invested, they didn't wake up one morning sparring. They stepped up. You'll see what I mean. Betty's vision of female equality was reserved, stoic, and seeped in her personal beliefs. Veering off into the weeds of what it meant to be a woman wasn't necessary. Everyone knew that. For Betty, the traditional family structure was fine. Economics were fine. Society was fine. The only thing women really needed, was equal pay, representation, and opportunity. Quote, "The gut issues of this revolution involve employment and education and new social institutions, and not sexual fantasy." This was deliberate. She didn't need any more drama. She was seeing plenty of it at home. In spite of a grueling, demanding schedule of appearances, writing, and speaking engagements, not to mention her political activity, Carl was on her back more and more. He started accusing her of neglecting her household responsibilities, like the laundry was more important than achieving legislative change. The kids were almost grown. No one was starving. It was almost as if they had exchanged roles. And for whatever reason, it bent his nose out of joint. She rolled her eyes every time Carl complained that he never saw her anymore. But the brunt of her frustrations she saved for the press. Betty abhorred media coverage that veered away from her talking points to focus on absurd and sensational topics, like the LGBTQ community, sexual harassment, domestic violence, rape, and poverty. To her, these distracted from the true feminist agenda, modifying the existing system. Abuse, harassment, and that whole gay thing were too frivolous and emotional. Some women were just too sensitive or dressed too revealing. And anyone can pull themselves and their children out of poverty if they just study and work hard enough. Says the sheltered, middle-class white woman with the equally employed husband and all the advantages and privileges that generations of that class structure brought along with it. Karens. Much like Carl's experience, the younger second-wave feminists couldn't get her to listen to them either. No matter how it was presented to her, Betty wouldn't budge. She closed ranks, refusing to entertain the sexual politics of a bunch of single girls she was sure would recant the minute they got a husband. And overthrow the systemic patriarchy? How is that gonna work? But the second waves were coming, with pretty Gloria right up front. We'll pick up the story next week. This has been Frenemies. Thanks for listening. Frenemies is a production of Toil and Trouble Media, executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Aaron Iris, and our music was performed by Snowflake and Admiral Bob. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen and tell your friends. It's a cheap way to support us, and it really helps the show get noticed. Tell your frenemies, too. We're good with that. And be sure to subscribe wherever you listen and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. If you want even more Toil and Trouble media in your life, be sure to check out our Patreon page, where, for a couple bucks, you can get access to early and ad-free episodes of all our shows, and our website at toilandtroublemedia.com, where we have merch, blogs, and much more. And as always, thanks for listening.